Rules. Rules. I have, for my entire life, had a big problem with rules.
Follow the rules.
And as a photographer, it's no different because every photographer, when they start out, learns that for your photos to be any good, they must follow a few rules.
Learn the right way.
Rules designed to keep our photos safe, a starting off point to allow us to grow. I think not. The problem with rules is that once you learn them, it's very hard to unlearn them.
You're doing it wrong.
Sure, you may push the edges a bit, venture out of your comfort zone for a while, but you will forever come back to your home base, go with what you are comfortable with, and be worse off in the end. And here's the problem. Even if you like the results of these rules, calling them rules implies that any result other than these is somehow worse, somehow wrong. Today I want to talk about 5 landscape photography rules that I think stifle the creativity of anyone who learns them and cause everybody's photos to basically look the same. Let's start with my personal favorite, the rule of thirds. The rule of thirds is a compositional rule that divides your frame into 9 equal parts using lines at the 1 and 2/3 on the horizontal axis and the vertical axis. The idea is that in your composition, you should try to place important elements at one or more of the intersections of those lines to bring an artistic feel that's different from using like the center point of the image. This rule, however, gets taken further than its intention because if placing one important element on one of those lines is good, then placing more than one element on more than one of those lines must be better, right? Going further, making sure that your horizon line is precisely along one of these horizontal lines must be even better, and making sure that everything in your image lines up with these lines must make it perfect. Well, this is where the modern version of the rule of thirds has really landed. Horizons straight along one line, points of interest along another. The problem with this rule is that it promotes straight lines and ratios over having great subjects and telling a story about them, which I think is what photography is all about, a perspective. So how do you break this rule mentally? I think a good way to remove the rule of thirds is to focus on leading lines, not as a rule, but as a way to simply break away from ratios. But be careful of any compositional rule that might box you in. Okay, on to number 2. Waterfalls require slow shutters. There was a time in the past when cameras were simply less sensitive than they are today, and we didn't have things like neutral density filters or focus stacking, when the only way to take a photo of a waterfall that was in focus from front to back was to stop down your aperture and elongate your shutter. In those days, I'm sure nearly every photo of a waterfall was a calm, milky, flowing, peaceful scene of a waterfall carefully flowing over rocks and gently sculpting the landscape. Now, I've been to dozens of waterfalls, and I'm sure you have too. Would you say that a waterfall is a particularly calm and quiet piece of nature? I live only a short drive from Niagara Falls, and I don't think anyone would describe it as gentle. So why are all these modern photos I see of waterfalls all showing how peaceful and serene they are? In my experience, every waterfall I've ever been to has been a loud and impressive, kind of violent thing. Okay, so what's the problem? Well, I've taken a lot of images of waterfalls, and while sitting there trying to capture the scene, I have, adjusted my shutter speed to try to slow down the water and really get the look right. But after taking home hundreds of test images that were not the right speed, I think I've come to enjoy those more because they show off the power and the chaos that better represents what I saw and what I felt when I was there. Perhaps this is one of those times where mistakes take over and something new is born, a new perspective that tells a different story. But I think generally we just have more tools in our toolboxes these days, and we should explore what new opportunities we have, right? So again, there's nothing wrong with the classic long exposure waterfall look, nothing at all. But is that the only technique that can result in a beautiful image? Nope. Okay, next one. High apertures. I think this is a mainstream landscape photography thing that I used to find myself doing a lot, which is avoiding the higher f-stops. I'm talking about f14, f16, f18, f20. If you find yourself with a bit of anxiety now, that's because you believe what I believe, what we all believe, which is that the high f-stops are off limits because of diffraction. I think this rule is best dispelled by a bit of logic. In all optics, there's this effect that you need to take into account called the circle of confusion, which basically happens when light passes through a lens and gets focused on the other side. Light from different distances and of different wavelengths will focus differently, and even a single point source of light may not end up as a perfect point of light when it passes through a lens, lands on a sensor. You can think of this as a bit of scattering, But because the lens is round, the scattering is round, and you get a circle of scattered light, a circle of confusion. To picture this happening on a digital camera sensor, it means that out of focus light from one object will sort of leak into the pixels around it where it should have been captured. And what's happening is that that circle of confusion is now larger than the individual size of that pixel. And I think all photographers will understand this concept as it is the cause of bokeh, or the background blur that you get when using any lens at a very low aperture, or indeed using a long lens at really any aperture. So how is this related to high f-stops? Well, as you close down the aperture of a lens, the circle of confusion for any individual point becomes smaller. But if you continue to close down that aperture, the circle of confusion becomes a little bit larger again, and this is caused by an effect called diffraction. So the rule basically states that if you stop down your aperture past a certain point, diffraction will cause a bit of blurriness in your image, and this is something that you do not want. So you got to make sure that you don't go above like f11, stay at f8 if you can, but only if you want to do macro photography do you venture above that, because these high f-stops will make your images bad. Well, here's the problem. You can easily go online and find a calculator that will take your sensor size, number of megapixels, focal length of your lens, aperture, and then tell you when diffraction will begin to become visible when you are diffraction limited. But if you change any of those parameters, the calculation will change. Different aperture, different diffraction limit, different focal length, different diffraction limit, and different number of megapixels, different diffraction limit. So hold on. If I get a camera with a higher number of megapixels, say you go from 20 megapixels to 48 megapixels, the same image you take will be less sharp on a higher megapixel camera than on a smaller one? Well, technically, yes, because the circle of confusion for the lens and aperture is the same size, but now the individual pixels have shrunk, so the resolved image is somehow less sharp than before. So then why are those higher megapixel cameras considered more professional? Yeah, good question. The argument on the other side of this is that nobody looks at images zoomed in 100% because everybody's looking at them on a phone. And even when you print them, the printing process is going to introduce many more problems with sharpness than diffraction ever would. Yeah, exactly. So then what's the problem with these high apertures? Well, it's diffraction, of course. But we're saying that diffraction doesn't matter because nearly all people are looking at photos on phones? Yep. And on the other side of this, of course, a lower aperture will simply result in the image being more out of focus because of the circle of confusion. But that's more like an artistic choice rather than bad photos. Low apertures are perfectly fine, right? Okay, trying to paint an argument here, but maybe this logical breakdown helps you get over it. It certainly did for me. Once I realized that f8 didn't somehow allow me to avoid the laws of physics, I started to explore some of the higher f-stops, and I didn't notice a difference in the end result. Actually, I found that I was able to get more of my image in focus without really noticing the effects of diffraction. And actually, that's the next rule. The idea that landscape images should have everything in focus from front to back. I did a video recently about how to get lots of depth in your images, and there was one thing that I didn't really touch on in that video, which is that your eyes, being lenses, perceive depth in numerous ways. And one of those ways is when two objects can't be focused on at the same time. Your eyes can perceive that an object is further away in relation to another by seeing that it's out of focus, and your brain judges that difference as distance. So look, I have been taught, and I have taught, that in a landscape image, it's best to have everything in focus, front to back focus. I have used and taught focus stacking to achieve this result, and I think mostly I stand by that idea. But I think my impression of this is changing. Because one of the things I'm starting to question is whether the goal I'm going after is to simply make a recording of what I saw, or is it to leave the viewers of my images with the same impression that I had? And if what I'm going after is actually a technical achievement or an emotional one. So I think actually this is a rule that I'm going to break more and more. Probably first in my editing by leaving the slightly blurry backgrounds as they are and perhaps using a few less of the focus stack images that I took. Okay, on to the final one. And I think this one, I hope I don't anger anybody with this one. Thomas Heaton, a photographer that I'm sure all of you are familiar with, posted a video a few months ago in which he struggled with the idea of leaving some power lines in an otherwise beautiful image. Now, in this video, he grappled with this thought that if another photographer were to come out to this same location, they would see those power lines and think of him as a fraud. Well, I have some bad news for you all, because if you believe as he believes, then we are all frauds. Let me explain. There is a stigma that, including buildings, bridges, cityscapes, power lines, or really any evidence that humans exist on this planet, somehow takes your image out of being a landscape image and turns it into something else. Adding a building might turn your landscape photography into travel photography. Adding bridges, lighthouses, boats, etc., that might make your photo into fine art photography. And some photography competitions narrow their definition of landscape photography so that it does not include any human-made elements, and this stigma is then sent out into the community as a way to control what landscape photography is. Again, this dogmatic view of what landscape photography consists of becomes a rule that people must follow to fit in. So let's smash that idea apart, yeah? Let me give you some examples of unnatural things that people often mistake for natural beauty. Number 1, managed forests. A lot of publicly accessible forests, local woodlands, parks, they're managed, meaning that the trees are taken care of, trails are maintained, and the forest floor is cleared from the rot and brush. The same thing is true of beaches, where driftwood and other things that wash up on shore are cleaned out by humans collecting them. These elements, the leading line of a trail, the beautiful tree standing alone, these are more often than not created or altered on purpose by humans, but they're likely to be featured in landscape photography. Number 2 is lakes. Where I live in Ontario, there are lots and lots and lots and lots of lakes. And on them, cottages, beaches, campsites, and frequently, these lakes will actually be dammed up to manage their water level. The dam is there to keep the water level consistent throughout the year so that the cottages, beaches, campsites, trails, and general access to this natural beauty can be maintained throughout the year. This scene I captured in Algonquin in the fall is beautiful, but it's not a natural one, because the scene was created by damming the lake to have this higher water level that flooded out the trees. Okay, so why am I talking about this? Well, if lots of natural scenes that us photographers have a chance to capture are not fully natural, then how natural your photo is all really a matter of degrees. And to go back to Thomas Heaton's example, I bet that there is little about the landscape that he photographed that would have arose without human intervention. The power lines are just the most visible one. So here's my last little bit of rule-breaking advice. Just take photos. Take photos of whatever you want. Take photos using whatever settings you want. Follow the rules or don't follow the rules. Whatever you choose to do, stop thinking that there's a right way and a wrong way. There is only art, only the exploration, and only the emotion. Thanks very much for watching. Bye for now.
You must obey